Hello, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. We focus on great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, cosmologies, magnum opuses, intuitive forces. Things that you can really use as fundamentals or first principles, things that you can ground yourself with and kind of branch out from there. And we usually do obscure sources, things that you probably haven't heard about. And today is our 18th episode on the book called It's After the End of the World, Don't You Know That Yet? Which is on two groups of African-American jazz musicians, so-called, in Chicago in the mid-20th century. And we're in chapter 5. And we're about to start section 3, which is called Nonviolent Weapons. This higher mission involved mobilizing every potential resource to find creative ways of utilizing the skills of the entire collective. Each AACM member shared his or her strengths with the group, no matter how arcane. Leo Smith, for example, joined the group in 1967. Before he moved to Chicago, Smith was employed in what we might call real estate music. Smith would be contracted by families in Mississippi who were moving to a new house. As part of his job, he would ceremonially feel out the vibration of the house and then play his instruments for the purpose of playing the memories out of the house, releasing the corresponding tense areas so the house would not be haunted by the presence of the former owners. As an AACM member, sensing out tension in this way was to remain a special musical skill that Smith could share with other members. In this way, Smith was initiated into participatory leadership as the teacher of an occupation, a way to create work and exposure outside the jazz establishment. Many other musicians shared their specialties too, as the AACM started to become a fountainhead for eclecticism. In prior years, Lester Bowie had succeeded with a vaudeville tent show troupe, and he shared things like comedy presentations. Threadgill shared at least 2 sources of employment. He had once made his living playing parades, and he planned to create work as a funeral composer hired out by the deceased family specifically to play a piece at the funeral. Malachi Favors, a veteran of the Washington Park Afrocentric circles and a veteran of Sun Ra's orchestra, was one of the resident experts on African mythology. He maintained that through its various resources, creative music made a bridge in black music, a bridge between jazz, rock, spirituals, African music, all kinds of black music. It's all in there. You can hear it if you listen. End quote. Members eagerly embraced extra study to learn more about these creative weapons. Multi-instrumentalism was one practice that demonstrated the sacrifices made by creative musicians. Smith defined multi-instrumentalists as those who approach all of their instruments as one complete instrument. Members of the AACM learned about music in the abstract. It was much easier to learn new instruments because really it was the musician who was the instrument. Creative musicians learned to play focusing on the underlying theories of all instruments, of the human instrument, as well as the separate techniques of each one. As we have seen, Donald Garrett, with all his flutes, was a pioneer in this area. The practice, however, was widespread. Many of the horn players added to their versatility through multi-instrumentalism, becoming fluent on half a dozen or more different horns. This is not to mention all of the little instruments, whistles, rattles, bells, gongs, and the like, that the artists would employ. Even more inventive were the found instruments used to convey the realities of the city. Dustbins, hammers, and the hubcaphone, an invention of Henry Threadgill, which he created out of discarded automobile hubcaps. Moreover, many AACM efforts were environment pieces, which used natural sounds including waterfalls or thunderstorms, as well as urban sounds such as street chatter and traffic noises. All of these practices, however, were difficult and called for sacrifices. Roscoe Mitchell remembered, "When I was just playing alto sax, everything was great, no problem. Then I started to add all these other instruments and everything fell apart. But I'm glad I struggled through." Once the musicians did struggle through, their multi-instrumentalism had the potential to decenter the audience as a strategy to get them to pay attention. Listeners would be in suspense, not knowing what to expect. In some cases, they could not even tell which instrument was making which sound. How is a listener to assess the sound coming out of the hubcaphone? All of this helped to get the listener to attain the level of access concentration. The AACM used each creative weapon at its disposal to convey the sounds and spaces of the urban experience. One of the pathways was electronics. While many saw the use of electronic methods as antithetical to the organic pursuit of ancient African music, others embraced the change. Abrams, like Sun Ra, knew that since electronics were ubiquitous in modern city life, if musicians were aiming for true expression, then they could benefit by using electronics to describe their reality. The musicians understood that acoustic and electronic instruments were both technology. It was just a question of degree and intent. Amina Claudine Myers was one who was skeptical at first. Quote, "I've heard a lot of electronic pieces that sound just like 100 other electronic pieces. For a long time, that turned me off to synthesizers. But now I realize that they can be played with feeling." Many, however, remained wary. Quote, "What if you have all your electronics set up and all the lights go out?" wondered Fred Anderson. In the early 20th century, the Black creative music tradition had been repressed by the jazz establishments, representations, and repetitions. Still, behind the veil, musicians tried to sustain and pass on their traditions. In the 1960s, the AACM attempted to bring these traditions back toward the people through a synthesis of the esoteric and exoteric. Through creative self-sacrifice, self-presentations, and then petitions, the musicians sought to sustain creative music, expand the creative music underground to the level of subculture, then expand it into the culture at large by promoting audience participation. As Don Moye remarked, "The music that we play isn't mine, it's yours, it's everybody's. It comes through me, maybe because I'm trained. I'm a trained conduit of music, but it is the music of us all." Okay, this section is called Self-Presentations. Abrams, Mitchell, Jarman, Bowie, and Favor set the precedent for other musicians to present their works outside the jazz context. But this did not mean that AACM musicians never played bebop jobs. For some, especially those with families, the jazz-free revolution was not complete. They still played gigs. The difference was that they got rid of the notion that these supper club scenes and cocktail situations were the ultimate goals of their music. Other musicians chose to work day jobs in order to refuse the nightclubs outright. Some relied upon unemployment to survive. In doing so, they sought to change the performance to invoke a ritualized atmosphere for a high level of audience attention. Instead of nightclubs and cocktail lounges, they decided to present their creative music in churches, coffee houses, health food stores, art galleries, elementary schools, prisons, retirement homes, and college campuses. One of the AACM dicta stated that if any member wanted to present an event and wanted it to be called an AACM performance, he or she would have to choose a majority of musicians from within the organization. Members would also be responsible for procuring the space, promoting, posting flyers for the presentation, taking tickets, and cleaning up afterwards. A great commitment was required from everyone, for the AACM put on several local presentations per week between 1966 and 69, often 7 nights a week. Some shows were well intended, some weren't, remembered saxophonist Ed Wilkerson. If it snows 20 inches and you have a concert, you don't cancel that concert even if no one shows up. I've played when there was absolutely no one in the audience. The idea is that you're playing the music for yourself and for the people, but also for something more than that. And though an empty house is not the sort of thing you look forward to, if you can really play hard and throw yourself into the music when no one is there, with a full house, there'll be no problem. It has to do with professionalism and embracing a certain spirit, generating a certain energy. You're not relying on outside things like money or people to push you, but something from inside. End quote. Such a stance taught individual humility. So did the do-it-yourself ethic. One night a member might be the conductor of an orchestra, the next night sweeping floors and cleaning toilets after the presentation. Such disciplines promoted a group ethic and made it hard to hold on to a big ego even after musical success as a composer. Mitchell's and Jarman's groups, being among the most tenured, with a long exposure to the practices of the experimental band and AACM, were often the first ones to seek out wider audiences for presentation. For example, one significant inroad, especially with the white community, happened at Mandel Hall on the University of Chicago Southside campus. These creative presentations undoubtedly conveyed a new and different atmosphere to the audience. At Mandel, there was commonly a mixed crowd with middle-class white bohemians and black nationalists, two groups that had misrepresented black creative music in the past. In these venues, the creative musicians mostly attempted to introduce listeners to the different space of creative music and to let them know that black musicians were naturally spiritual leaders and healers. Howard Mandel, a young white listener, was a regular witness to AACM presentations. He remembers that they, quote, sounded like surrealists announcing a dramatic shift of understanding. This was my head-changing music, my soul-shaping experience. Likewise, one black commentator, Floyd Webb, indicates that the AACM presentations were at least partially successful. Upon seeing AACM members at a restaurant on the South Side, Webb testified, "There was a sense of the spirit that I grew up with at work in this music." Saxophonist Maurice McIntyre pulled, Calipurusha is his changed name, pulled the chaotic chord from my being and weaved peace in me, my soul. This was another kind of storefront where the creator had set up a soul washing. And these men, to me, were like priests, a gathering of the body, and the word was not spoken. It came to me in sheets of sound. There were few close to me who took the time to try to understand it. It don't make sense. End quote. Webb, as a potential believer and convert of AACM presentations, was ready for the next step, petition. But, as he indicates, other listeners were still unable to recognize the different standards that were needed. They were unable to quiet judgment and therefore unable to access concentration. This was particularly harmful to the AACM when the listener was a critic, because they limited their perceptions to the secular expectations of establishment jazz. Critics missed the hidden messages of creativity. In addition, the critics' published columns legitimated their opinions over the music itself. For example, one writer lodged a complaint about restrictions on smoking and drinking during AACM presentations. Roscoe Mitchell concisely explained the primary rationale for the rule. Quote, "I don't feel the music is understood by people who are drunk." Not accepting the artist's intention to bring the music to a higher level, the critic argued, quote, "You can carry the integrity bag too far," which may be true if integrity is only a bag. But on the other hand, if integrity is a key element in the musician's mission, it would naturally be extended to the audience. The same critic could also not understand the element of chance that was necessary in creative music presentations. When something is done spontaneously, things are not always going to work out exactly according to expectations. The critic, however, remarked, quote, "A lot of things they were doing were exciting. Some of the things were beautiful. Other things, man, I wanted to get up and go home." This writer did not consider that perhaps he thought things were beautiful when he related to them, but he wanted to go home when he did not relate. He put the burden wholly on the musicians and remained unaware of his own projections and his need to go beyond taste and come to the music by focusing through the difficult periods. He was unwilling to withhold judgment and access a higher level of concentration. The same critic was distraught over the musicians' serious demeanor and their lack of emceeing and cheerleading to get the crowd into it. Quote, "The concept of public relations took another beating," and then he asked, "Whatever happened to all the joy in jazz?" He chided the musicians for their failure to verbally communicate with the audience, when in fact the musicians had already decided on the priority of nonverbal methods of communication. Smith argued it has to do with the Western culture's inability to understand things that aren't written down, things that aren't measured. This critic, writing in the Journal of Popular Culture, betrayed a secular establishment bias in his criticism. He, in fact, had once been a jazz musician and had even performed with Abrams back in the 1950s. Now, trying to make it as a writer, he attempted to sensationalize the hipness of the scene on the surface, with little attempt to listen to or understand the music. In fact, after 1 hour, the critic admitted, I became bored and left the room. Before leaving, the spectacle of the hip scene had him more interested. He commented that in one corner sat a Jesus-looking character and a Jewish-looking chick was reading Gorilla. Moreover, 3 other bearded boys were avidly consuming the I.F. Stone report, and there were a host of other hippie types looking glib while standing around. Ties were not to be seen, but the quality of clothing of about half of those present indicated that in the not-too-distant past, a lot of somebodies had dropped mucho bread at a few of Whitey's plusher haberdasheries. There were also a few gents present in African garb. He also noted that, quote, practically all the Negroes present had barricaded themselves into one corner of the room. Perhaps this critic wrote about the ambience because he could not describe the music in words, but still had to write about something. Whatever the reason, it obscures the central message of the musicians, which was spiritual and nonverbal. A select few critics, on the other hand, understood the incommensurability of criticism and creative music presentations. An Australian columnist, when reviewing a concert at Noyes Hall at the University of Chicago, understood that, quote, to hear this music, the listener also must engage himself, grow excited, aggressive, or quiescent, as the music suggests, or, as occasionally happens, rest in the doldrums when creativity or a fusion fails. As a critic, he also commented, quote, there are few occasions on which a critic cannot master a comparison or a set of influences. Neither are relevant here. Another downbeat critic, after seeing one creative music presentation, argued, quote, they should be classified as experimenters. For this reason, I feel that an evaluation of their work should be geared to examining their creativity and its directions, more than the degree to which they have perfected techniques. This critic, however, failed to take his own advice, for he wrote in the very next sentence, for purposes of technique, they would benefit from, once again, for presentations. One way to ensure heightened attention on the part of the audiences was by ritualizing the performance. One witness to a later Abrams presentation described his invocation, the gestures indicating the start of a ritual. Quote, he struck a deeply resonant paced gong, blew a police whistle, beeped a horn, and shook some bells around his neck to announce to audience and piano that the ceremony had begun. He kept all of these sounds going while turning on a rather sour tape recording of his own piano. Against this din, he played with the strings inside the piano. He leaned into the piano, repeatedly blew the whistle at the strings, struck the gong, and sat down at the keyboard. The AACM used diverse ways to intone a ritualistic ambiance, including drama and theatricality. Indeed, as a relevant comparison, Mitchell and Jarman were referred to more than once as commedia dell'arte players. At another creative presentation at the Abraham Lincoln Center, one witness recalled that, quote, the ticket holders were given crayons with which to decorate paper bags, and they were to wear on their heads during the performance. At times, comedy was used, but at other times, the drama was heavier. Just as in New York Jazz Free, one strategy for inducing concentration entailed taking the audience through cathartic experiences. In 1967, one downbeat writer saw Joseph Jarman's group with Fred Anderson, Thurman Barker, William Brimfield, Christopher Gaddy, and Charles Clark. He describes the scene. Jarman and Clark rushed from the curtains, reading poetry and counterpoint and ringing bells. The curtains parted to reveal a psychedelic setting. Variously hued lights flashed. Junk was piled like Rauschenberg sculpture. Clothes were strewn everywhere, giant pop poster canvases of Ku Klux Klansmen and Alabama sheriffs hung high at stage rear. Stage lights went on, lights flashed on and off. There was a murder, and the body, fallen amid the junk on the floor, was hauled away. There were angry shouts from the rear of the auditorium by some of the musicians. The ceiling lights went on once again, and Jarman, borne on the shoulders of two men, was carried across the stage with Ersatz blood smeared on his t-shirt front. The two musicians out front described the leaflets to each member of the audience, small pink sheets with one word printed on them: hate. The ceiling lights died once more, and the entire auditorium was lit only by the flashing colored bulbs on stage, which revealed the group in silhouette, blowing in relaxed ensemble. Then, after creating a diversion, Jarman and Gaddy had moved to a balcony-like runway high above the rear of the auditorium, and there, against the swelling rubato theme played by the remainder of the group on stage, and wild shouts of "Bravo!" they began to drop bucketfuls of confetti on the heads of the audience beneath them. The creative musicians also used their physical appearances to invoke the heightened attention of ritual atmosphere. Abrams, Jarman, Favors, and other musicians begin to wear African face paint and traditional garb for presentations. Jarman explained that we use face paint, for example, not as war paint, but in place of masks, which are used in cultures of every ethnicity to subjugate the personality of the performer so he can more easily become a representative to the community. Masks and costumes make universal statements and are archetypal symbols. Lester Bowie agreed, quote, "The mask serves to eliminate the individual and puts you into the art. That was the purpose of the mask, to take it away from your ordinary being." Many AACM concerts also began with a silent moment, a turn to face the east, and the sound of a gong, which, in Barker's words, intones the spirit of music itself. In AACM presentations, the steps to ritualize the music were attempts to get listeners to suspend secular expectations and considerations of like and dislike and access a higher level of concentration. The problem was that listeners, especially critics, did not want to, and in fact could not, access concentration for fear of losing, quote, objectivity and their ability to rationalize the music. For the AACM, however, critical objectivity was a misleading enterprise. According to Abrams, quote, "These systems are completely false. In Downbeat, it's the 5-star rating system used for reviews of both concerts and recordings. Our promotional device, a way of making the magazine sell. If you subscribe, for example, you get the last 5-star record on the list. But what right does someone have to make judgments instead of you, the listener? You try it. You be the judge. Why put your confidence in someone who is probably paid by a record company?" Smith went further and contended that, quote, "the pleasing arrangement of sounds, that's all just a bunch of deception," and that, quote, "I don't accept that concept of playing." Anthony Braxton believed that a critic's rating, quote, "has nothing to do with the realness of a creative offering," while George Lewis felt, quote, "it's amazing people still believe in good or bad critical ratings after all that's gone down." In the AACM, criticism was more easily accepted from insiders who would actually know the criteria for creative music. Braxton indicated his preference for this constructive criticism given in person, in private, before or after the performance. Wadada Leo Smith also pointed to the AACM's understanding of nonverbal criticism, which made external written criticism peripheral to them. Smith, when discussing analogies with African music, explained, "He, the chief, don't say you broke the law or this or that. He stands up and everybody in the community knows immediately what happened. Or, for example, if some dancers are dancing on the steps and one of them falls, The moment the tumble begins, the crowd around him closes up on him. Nobody actually sees the guy hit the ground. They protect him. Concerning internal criticism, Mitchell, for one, was willing to admit that the music had a long way to go, that it, quote, is a young music and it's not going to come into its own for maybe 50 or 60 years. It's broad, but not as broad as it's going to be as it matures. Through experience, Mitchell knew that, quote, every now and then something will happen like magic, and you can do anything you want to, but generally that's not the way it is. You have to work at it. Likewise, Bowie admitted that only about 35 to 40% of the time was everything working. At other times, the musician has really got to work. The musician, in other words, was not always able to channel creativity. At this stage, however, the details of how the music sounded was really not the AACM's point of focus. It was more important just to be presenting themselves outside of the limitations of jazz. Lester Bowie explained, quote, it's coming spiritually first, and once you have the spiritual idea, then technically I'll try to polish it up. Okay, I think we're going to stop there, and we will resume tomorrow, learning more about the AACM and their adventures in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s. A form of wisdom that we can use for our syncretic religions as we begin to realize the inevitable about the former religions here. And that's kind of this unit of videos on this channel called Reciprocal Church. All right, thanks for tuning in today. Please come back tomorrow. Have a great day. Also, if you want a copy of a discography of all the music here, that you can, you know the names of the titles and so on, so you can look for them and perhaps buy them, then just send me any type of donation on Cash App or Venmo. $1 will do it, and I'll send you a copy. Okay, thanks. Have a great